right. It'll go live in there's usually a delay of a few seconds, but we should be live now on both platforms. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special Terraform Tuesday. Today, I have some guests with me, and we're going to be talking about when should you run Terraform apply in a CI/CD pipeline context. And so before we get into the main topic at hand, I do want to introduce my two special guests who reached out and wanted to have this debate. So first up, Soren Martius, welcome to Terraform Tuesday. You're a repeat offender, but for those who haven't seen you before, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ned, and thanks for joining too, Malcolm. So I'm Soren. I happen to be the founder of Terramate and now serving here as the CPO. Terramate is in the TACO space, so Terraform automation and collaboration software. I guess how we differentiate, though, is that instead of just focusing on collaboration and automation, the hypothesis that we're following here is that actually the problem for most users starts way earlier: how to structure code, how to structure state files, orchestrate those, and by the end of the day also observe your entire asset inventory, cloud asset inventory with infrastructure as code. Partially, we do open source. Partially, some of our solutions are commercial and closed source. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, welcome, Soren. And our other new guest, who I haven't met before, so this is exciting, but I think we've interacted many times on LinkedIn, Malcolm Matalka. Welcome. Who are you and what do you do?
Thanks for having me. Great to be here with Soren and you. I am co-founder of Terrateam, which is addressing an orchestration of Terraform and Tofu code as well, but we're taking more of an Atlantis adjacent approach where we're really focused on getting inside your workflows and bringing your Terraform infrastructure management closer to your software workflows. And we're very flexible and go with whatever your existing and desired workflows are. We try to fit into that seamlessly.
Okay.
And for watchers, over the next few days, you have to take a drink of your favorite liquid every time you can say Terrateam when you meant to say Terramate, and vice versa.
That's a good one.
I'm not gonna lie. I've been writing some scripts and posts lately, and I have swapped those a few times myself. It's the same letters. That's the thing that gets me. But I understand two totally different products, but you both are in a similar space, which is working within the Terraform automation pipelines. And while you're not running those pipelines yourselves necessarily, you are involved in the process of how code makes it from someone's developer system into a repository and then actually deployed to infrastructure. And one of the core decisions to make in that whole process is, all right, I've successfully run a Terraform plan. I think I know what's going to happen. Now it's time to run Terraform apply. When do I do that? Do I merge the changes from my feature branch into main and then apply? Or do I apply it and then see what happens before I make the merge? Soren, we've had this conversation before, so I'm actually going to hand this over to Malcolm first to kind of give his perspective on when the appropriate time to apply is and what factors might go into that.
Thank you very much. I think at the end of this, Soren and I are actually going to be pretty aligned that if you've thought deeply about the workflow you want, that's probably the workflow you should have. And Terrateam is happy to support any workflow you do. I personally am more on a apply before merge. And for me, one of the main motivations for that is that we're just not at the point yet where a plan is going to turn into a successful apply. And I think getting that iteration time down, especially for infrastructure, is super important for a lot of teams. And maintaining that inside of a single pull request lets you just go, go, go. And on top of that, we have all this tooling that we can use that automates making sure that goes well. So for example, you can take out locks to make sure that nobody is going to make a change that overwrites your change until you're done. We can also automate auto merge, for example, So if you have auto merge, everything goes well. At the end of the day, these things kind of turn out to be the same thing. You've just applied, and then it immediately goes into main branch. And there is, this little race in time of where that exactly has happened. But if things are working, from your perspective, there's really not a huge difference between those two. But I think there is a huge difference if things aren't going how you want them to go.
Okay. I got what you're saying. In my mind, there are some potential issues with having that pull request remain open. And I want to get Soren's perspective on what are some potential downfalls to keeping the pull request open and like updating and reapplying and updating and reapplying versus doing the merge.
Yeah. So I think in general, because we had this discussion previously, I'm like, the way that the mental model that I have around, whether to use apply before merge or, whether applying on merge back to the main branch, like very much depends on your organization, on your setup, the team sizes, how many do you work in a mono repository, et cetera, et cetera. And I agree with Malcolm that the providers and the cloud providers APIs are not yet there to basically ensure that a plan that is guaranteed to be applied successfully, which is probably the only reason for apply before merge to even exists. So to get back to your question, so I've worked with both exhaustively, and there's a few things. There's a few arguments of basically a few discussion items why I prefer to apply after merge, based on learnings that I found valuable for me. Okay, so now everybody needs to come up with their own research and with their own experiences. But like I would say you don't really need any additional tooling or infrastructure. Okay, so now I know that there's a bunch of vendors out there, including Terrateam and Atlantis, and that heavily advocate for this workflow, and that their offering is partially built around this, not entirely, but partially. So my statement here is like, hey, at Terramate, or my personal belief is like, you should probably not need to add additional infrastructure just for implementing specific workflows. But if you want to do that, then there's a variety of solutions out there that you can choose from, right? So simplicity is the point here that I'd like to mention. Second, and that's for me the even more so important side of the argumentation is, so now if I work in a mono repository, or let's say I work on a single repository with multiple teams, dozens of engineers perhaps, so we look at scale, okay? Applying before merge is relatively complex to handle. And then Malcolm already mentioned, okay, we have logs, but the efficiency of those logs widely varies on the size of view and the structure of environments, right? Because if you, by the end of the day, say, and most of the companies manage infrastructure as code in that way, you probably have 3 different state files, right? Dev, staging, production. So now the moment a team opens up a pull request on the production environment, basically locks on the environment, makes it not feasible to use by others, right? So it increases blocking times and then potential conflicts too. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think the smaller the environment and the smaller the team size working on it, the more suitable apply before merge can actually be. But the more you look at the scale, it's actually unlikely to manage it without running into bigger issues. Does it answer your question, Ned?
I think so. It raises several more, of course, as it always does. Malcolm, is there anything you want to respond to in that before I ask some more questions?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up those 2 points, Soren. One is the simplicity of an apply after merge workflow, as well as scaling. Because, and I read the blog post you guys did as well, which was really good. And that was the 2 big takeaways I had there as well, is this claim simplicity and scaling. I think that the reality is, whether you do an apply before or after, you still need this extra layer of tooling that's claimed not to be needed. And so for me, I think that removes the simplicity argument because you still
Hmm.
need to. So for example, in the blog post, the described workflow is your developer opens a pull request, they get a plan, they get approved on that plan, and then merge, and then the plan that was generated in step 2 is the one that's applied. But that actually is harder to do it's quite hard to do in a lot of generic CI/CDs because you have to maintain the state through this whole operation. Even if you go to, for example, the Terramate GitHub Actions, they create a new plan on the apply rather than use the one generated during the plan step. So it's just not actually that easy to do. And I think you do end up needing, regardless of which flow you have, this extra layer of software.
Yeah. If you think I get your point here, but if you think about it logically, the more so the deeper argumentation would be like, where's the value, and is the value in providing either of those workflows, or is the value of tacos more around let's say enhancing collaboration, guardrails, which a lot of vendors are marketing in that way, or now we have policies, and we can basically prevent our engineers that have no clue what they're doing, which is usually the pitch, right, from applying any destructive changes or so. I would not necessarily say that saving an artifact in at least major CI/CD platforms is nowhere is somewhat of a problem. But again, by the end of the day, and there's different companies also marketing differently. I'm not gonna. I'm gonna be honest. Terramate as of today doesn't have the capabilities of offering apply before merge, which is also partially of the reason why, of course, we're big fans. Or let's phrase it the other way around. We don't offer it because we don't think that this workflow is of much help, or also because a lot of our customers never ask for it. But by the end of the day, if you look at Terramate, Terrateam, it doesn't need to be one or another decision. It can be complementary too, in a sense that the mental model that I have here is, at least as of today, I made changes tomorrow. Hey, if folks want to use that workflow, then there are solutions such as Terrateam. And I think, by the way, you guys are doing a great job. I've been heavily advocating for you. If you haven't noticed it yet, Atlantis Digger and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's that point there is exactly right. And one of the great things about Terramate is that you can really put it into any workflow that you want as well. It runs the thing how you want it, but it can be part of something bigger.
I want to get back to a point that you made, Malcolm, regarding the plan file, because I don't think your problem was that it's hard to stash a plan file, because it's very easy to stash an artifact in any of the CI pipelines. But I think your larger point was, what happens if that plan is stale?
Yeah.
Can you expand on that and sort of what you see as the problem and the solution to that?
Yeah. So the plan, what is applied is just the in small of the larger problem here, which is you need to start managing the state, regardless of where you're performing the apply. So for example, Soren and I do a change. Mine, we both get approved. Mine gets in first. We're modifying the same infrastructure. Mine gets in first. His plan file is no longer valid, and we need to track it somewhere and manage it and force him to do a replan. And I think generic CI/CDs, once you start going down, okay, what happens when this happens? What happens when that happens? You're basically building out these products anyways, just by another name. And it might not feel like you're doing it because you're doing it one brick at a time, when you could have taken that engineering effort and gone towards your product or something else and just got Terrateam. We're open source as well, so you can download it right now and get going. And there's lots of other options out there as well, depending on exactly what you want. But the complexity goes up especially once you start scaling and you have more people collaborating, and you need to make sure you're not killing velocity, but also making sure that the correct things are getting applied, that everyone has agreed is the thing that should be applied.
Do you advocate for taking more of a multi-repo approach and breaking apart large monorepos to avoid that situation?
I'm very pro monorepo Terrateam is designed to work very well in a monorepo. So for example, Soren mentioned correctly that different locking granularity depends on the product. We have a very narrow one where it's the directory and the workspace you're operating in that directory, which is the unit we take a lock out on. So in a Terrateam flow, what you do is you plan, and then you can either merge or apply. And at that event, either one of those events, a lock is taken out. And the lock is released when you do the complementary event. So if you apply, once you merge, that lock is released. And we also have workflow support such that if the apply succeeds, then we'll auto merge that as well. So you don't have to worry about somebody saw it went well and forgot to hit the merge button but went home. It'll just automatically happen.
Gotcha. With those little prompts in there, or some automation.
Yeah.
We do have a few questions that I wanted to that came up in the chat, and I do want to address those. So Edward Delgado asked, what would be the best strategy to import resources created via ClickOps? So if you're in a scenario, somebody went and created resources, how do you get those imported? Are they imported and Terraform? He goes on to ask, after those resources are imported and Terraform plan is run to match the infrastructure, the next step would be manually interconnect each resource. Is there a tool that is a little simpler? So I guess his main question is the challenge around importing resources and kind of dealing with drift in an automation scenario. Malcolm, you seem like you're chomping at the bit with an answer for this.
I think I can go after the import question, but I think Soren's probably more qualified for the question of how to interconnect these things and if there's any support around that. I think one big improvement over Terraform and Tofu over the last year or so is the import block. So it used to be this very imperative operation where you needed access to all your credentials. And if you're trying to lock down what you're running, you don't want to give out credentials to be able to run this imperative operation to pull it in. But now we can declaratively import resources through the import block. So if you have a situation, just look up the import block. There's great documentation out there, a lot of great how-tos out there. Do that. And of course, infrastructure as code, you have to figure out how you want to write this code to match up with that.
Soren, did you have something you wanted to add to the mechanics of the import?
Yeah, I think important is to mention that the configuration needs to exist first, right? So the resource declarations need to exist first before we can use either the declarative approach to importing resources or the command. So I actually agree with Malcolm. I think importing is a solved problem. Declarative approach is preferred, right? Because you can go through CI/CD, review those changes, and eventually the plan. But the bigger sort of problem is to get non-codified resources codified, whereas there's commercial and then open source vendors out there. I guess from my point of view, none of those are great yet, but becoming much better. What I typically see, that's a little bit of an excursus here, but if you look at large non-codified environments, a typical CTO decision is to actually not import those back and codify those because the investment is too big versus just focusing on day zero operations for new infrastructure.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. We have another question from Basil, who asked, how's the size of a pull request, i.e. how much code changes, how many people work on that, etc.? How does that affect the decision on apply before or after merge? So do you think that the size of the pull request has an impact on when you would want to merge the code?
I'll jump in there. My view here is, particularly in a large one, you're probably going to want to do an apply before merge, because if it's really that large, I can really see you hitting even something very not related to your code, but hitting API limits as you're running through this big change could be a problem that forces a rerun.
Yeah, I still think we are missing lots of.
Don't do big PRs. That's the real thing here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, from my point of view, I mean, monster PRs are mistakes in the first place, and then monolithic, how Matt Goey called them, terroristic or terrorless state files. are a crime too. And I think the there's lots of stuff that we haven't discussed yet, like, hey, is apply before merge actually following GitOps principles, and what happens if we need to hotfix from main because other state files break and whatnot. But as of this specific question, so the obvious argumentation here is if your runtime to apply a plan is like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, right? And now 35 minutes in, the plan is partially applied, right? And you run into an error. I guess what Malcolm is trying to say, instead of merging a pull request back into the main branch and ending up having a partially applied plan, you'd actually try to fix the specific PR, and then accept that in the meantime you have kind of a dangling branch that diverges the state from the main branch until this is fixed, correct?
Yes, that is what I'm saying, especially in this case where it might not be a code change that fixes this. You could have run in something that's outside of anything that your code's doing.
Right, like
there may not be a meaningful PR to do in order to fix this.
Yeah,
right.
I get it, like a quota, etc.
Yeah, it's all those quotas.
Yeah. So I still believe that it'd be way more safe to actually merge back to main, and then if that I agree. So the downside to it, what you could run into is that, hey, the apply fails on main, and now in order to fix it, I need to go through this tedious process of opening up a PR again, right? But at least main represents the single source of truth. So in the meantime, other teams working on branching out from main, etc., we make sure there's like no conflicting operations. Does that really apply to all real-world scenarios? I again think it depends. Oh, my camera just ran out of battery. Give me a second.
We can still hear you.
Yeah.
No worries, but there you go.
Now I'm on my MacBook camera. That's unfortunate. So I still think it depends, and it very much depends on the setup of your team and the setup of your code. Malcolm, I know you advocate heavily for mono repositories. I like them too, but the reality is that once you start bringing infrastructure a little bit closer to developers, specifically tied to service deployments, which is something that I see very often for companies that operate at the scale, it actually doesn't make that much sense anymore. So my point is, merge and apply might be in some specific scenarios more time consuming to handle, specifically if you run into issues, because I agree this process of us opening up repeated APIs is somewhat annoying, but it at least takes away most of my other concerns. Hopefully in the future, though, and that's the bigger problem that I would like to get solved, is we don't discuss, or we don't have too much time wasted in discussing what workflows to use, but we focus more on making the providers and cloud APIs more mature. So the most errors, or the more errors can be caught at plan time, and the better it would be, no matter the workflow, I guess.
Yeah, I would love to see that too, just better quality plans and providers. I think that the code infrastructure to make that happen, I think, is there. I think it is just such a hard problem for to match what a large cloud vendor is doing at the scale we have in Terraform and OpenTofu. You get like an equal representation that is going to run.
Matt Gowie just commented here on the better provider validation. Part of it could be laid at the feet of the providers, but ultimately those providers are just consuming the APIs of the cloud.
Yeah.
And so some of that work needs to be done on the API side to support better dry runs and planning. And sort of like, it really should flag to you if that's not a valid VM size, or you are out of quota on a particular VM model. That is something that I don't know why the API couldn't return that information back on a plan.
Yeah, well, that's just not how REST works in most cases, right? Quotas are a totally different endpoint.
Yeah.
And in theory, so in theory, you have all of the information available, or a lot of those information available, but it's then the responsibility of the provider to actually query it, unless you ask AWS and Google Cloud to change the data model. So I agree. That's why I also said before, cloud providers and APIs. I agree that the problem is sort of on both ends. I still think the bigger problems are the providers, though. Like if you look at how the providers work, and specifically anything else than AWS, some of them are quite messed up and very much outdated. So I believe we can do much better here. But then also too, yes, the cloud APIs need to become more mature and also more stable and backwards compatible.
Yeah, we do like to beat up on the providers a lot, though, which I agree there's a big problem to be solved there. But there are just really hard problems in terms of how the cloud vendors do things. So, for example, you might update IAM, and it might take a minute or two for that to propagate around the world. And by that point, you're trying to apply this other thing. And there's nothing wrong with the code at all, but just the cloud provider hasn't done the propagation fast enough.
Mhm.
And that's got nothing to do with what a provider can do, a Terraform provider. And it's just this issue we have to deal with. And it's even if the cloud vendor says, here's the SLA we have, well, you might get that one point where it's taking 5 minutes instead of 3 or whatever it is.
Right. I've definitely seen that, especially with Azure AD, now Entra ID, propagating its identities. If it was created in one region but hadn't propagated to another, or even within the same region, then I would get an error that object doesn't exist yet. And then 2 minutes later, it was fine.
Yeah.
So, and that's the sort of thing where the provider can put in shims to allow for certain timeouts and retries to help with that. But yeah, the eventual consistency thing, I don't know if there's a great way around it.
Yeah, I could see cloud vendors just eventually getting to the point where creating the IAM role, for example, just doesn't return until it's propagated. But it depends on if they want to give us those guarantees. But I think the cloud vendors are going to catch up to what people want faster than we're going to catch up into simulating them better.
Yeah.
Valid point.
Given the amount of resources, it probably makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Markham, I'd actually be interested in learning. I mean, looking at the kind of companies that you're working with here, and now that we have this workflow discussion, it is nowhere over, I guess. Do you see a specific pattern of organization tend towards using one or another?
We see a lot of our customers are definitely more mono, but I think that's sort of a self-selection bias.
Mm-hmm.
They see what we can do there and they like it. We do have some that come in with just absolutely every single repo is unique, and then they're offering, or they only have one state file to represent one state file. We also consume modules inside a mono repo pretty well, and we don't force people to go through a registry or something like that. And so really, I think we're self-selecting on people into monos.
Got it. And on workflows, are
What
they all apply before merge, or?
Most. So a lot of them that are new, I would say, come in, not new, but sort of a smaller scale, definitely do apply before merge. And I think that is partially a lot of people coming through Atlantis and wanting a more enterprise ready Atlantis. The people that we interact with that are coming more from Terraform Cloud Path, they are more into an apply after merge workflow.
Yeah.
Right.
Very interesting. I don't know to how many companies I've talked to at this year, but I can count the amount of companies or the organizations, engineering teams that we talked to that asked for apply before merge. On one hand, this tells you something about like how different our targets are here. Yeah, we have a bunch of Terramate cloud customers that run on Atlantis. I don't think we have a Terrateam customer yet. Maybe in the future. But yeah, my take here is also, I mean, it's an endless discussion, but this kind of better Atlantis model, yeah, it's like so many companies are doing this. How Spaceshift and EMV0 originated, yeah. I think you guys are, by the way more sexy by being so close to the actual CI/CD, because inventing or providing yet another CI/CD platform in 2025 soonish is probably not the best pitch. So totally agree here. And yeah, I guess the route that we're taking is, as said early on, if you do apply, merge and apply, you probably don't need another solution. And then Terramate is adding all the observability and policies. So basically pretty much what you guys do without the workflow management, I would say, because we shift this to client side, right? And Terramate, there are no workflows configuration, because the client decides when to orchestrate stacks in what order, etc. But if folks need that, then I think as of today, there's actually great synergies between the two of us. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think we should do an integration with each other at some point in the near future.
Yeah.
There is a question that kind of gets to what you're talking about, clients doing merge before apply or apply after merge. Someone asked, find the person's name, I want to give credit. Jay Johnson asked, is there anyone that you've seen that's doing apply and then merge in dev and QA environments, and then flipping it and doing merge and then apply in the production and like UAT environments, or maybe even vice versa? Have you seen it where they do one approach for some environments and a separate approach for others?
For us, it's very consistent in that they want the same workflow in both. But to go back to, if you have multiple environments, there's a lot of ways to structure this. I know, like, I've seen Soren answer questions on our Terraform about this as well. Should I do one branch per environment or one directory per environment? We generally promote people doing one directory per environment, so all changes are in one place. And people get into an apply before merge workflow in that case, because they might want to do the apply in the PR, make sure everything looks good, and then give the thumbs up and then do it to production. And it's just cognitively easier for people to still do the apply process before merging, so it match what they're doing in dev.
Okay, so in your case, you're seeing a consistent same approach for every environment.
Yes.
Okay. What about you, Soren?
I've seen both, and I know there is a similar company, a similar solution to Terrateam out there that's advocating heavily for Digger. But my take here is, again, simplicity. So I actually also would say, like, hey, stick to a single workflow and use it at least throughout a project, which then I think in our terms here equals a repository. So I'm not a big fan of mixing workflows. Have I seen it? Yes. Yeah, I've seen a bunch of companies doing that, but I also, every single organization that I know that has used apply before merge has eventually moved on to merge and apply when they scale up. Like every single organization, literally every single organization.
Do you think there's a level of maturity there as they get more comfortable with the tool set and how things tend to fail?
I think there's a level of it's a level of scale, not a level of maturity. I actually think that a lot of the rather mature companies tend to look at apply before merge at some point, because of what Malcolm mentioned, the fact that a lot of issues are only caught at merge time. So it's a big issue. It's a big problem for a lot of teams out there to lose time and like, oh, the plan looks great, and now I merge back to main and the apply fails. It is, and it's kind of the biggest pain point, I would say, as of today, and when it comes to workflows. But then, if you look at all the other downsides, specifically when managing infrastructure as code at a scale, with, again, the typical platform DevOps team ratio to engineers is like what, 1 to 15, 1 to 20, or something like that. That means that most organizations in the mid-market end up maybe having 3 to 5 DevOps engineers that handle infrastructure. It's actually not that much. It's actually like, it's ridiculous that we need supporting tooling around enabling a team of 3 to 5 even. But now if you look at organizations that have made infrastructure accessible for developers, or technically sophisticated teams where you would look at dozens of developers managing Terraform, dozens of pull requests open at the same time. This is when the question of workflow, I believe, becomes a lot more important. And where, for me, at least, the downsides of applying before merging back to main, due to the nature of moving out of GitOps, having to manage all those logs, etc., is actually very problematic, and it doesn't work. So now, due to the nature of Terramate being in the field of like, hey, we're helping you to split up state files into multiple isolated smaller units, orchestrate those, and observe those, we obviously mostly talk to those kind of companies because those are the organizations that have those problems at the scale, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that obviously Malcolm is biased, right? Because he's representing the interests of his customer, which is customers with an entire different profile than the organizations that we work with. By the end of the day, both are valid. To sum up your question, should you mix workflows? I don't think that's a good idea at all. I think consistency.
That was the question. I forgot.
Yeah, consistency. Sorry, I moved away a little bit, but consistency and simplicity are often not bad choices to make.
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting how much the capabilities in marketing around our respective products also filter the customers that are coming in. Because we have plenty of customers running at scale that are totally fine with apply before merge, and they're doing like an auto merge workflow. So they get the benefit there of, if it succeeds, the time between a lock being there and gone is nothing. But they do get the iteration speed that we see that they need. Right. For when something's wrong in the pull request and it's not applying properly. So it's just, and I think it's just someone looks at us and they say, all right, well, this is the workflow we're interested in. We already have this workflow. We're big enough where we don't want to retrain engineers on what the new workflow should be. So we'll do this.
Right. So I want to go back to what Soren was mentioning earlier, how if the infrastructure is all managed by like a DevOps team and you have that 1-to-20 ratio or whatever, they can have their own weird internal way of managing all this stuff. But if you're going to expand it out and let developers start taking the reins on infrastructure, on managing their infrastructure, like what are the key changes or practices that you see being required there to standardize on a process? Malcolm, if you want to go first, what do you think about making that transition from letting the single team manage infrastructure to letting developers kind of self-service?
I think this is one of the biggest challenges we see our customers with, and I don't think a lot of them end up executing it in a way where the devs are really infrastructure experts by the end of it, and they're often coming back to the ops team for support. That's one reason for us. We have a pretty fine-grained RBAC control, and being true GitOps in that all of our configuration is in the repo, it helps people always be in a pull request and modify settings to us without having to go through like a new UI or something like that. So what we see is devs don't really want to learn a new system. They don't want something they have to click around in, something like that. They want it to be with their code, and being with their code means they're applying these similar practices.
When you say in their code, do you mean the same repository that where their code lives, their infrastructure lives?
Yeah, for a lot of them, we do have that where they will make the application change with the infrastructure change, and they might create the infrastructure beforehand before they actually close the merge pull request and let the deploy happen.
I see. So it's more of an orchestrated software deployment setup where I need to make that infrastructure change before I can actually push the application artifacts out.
Yeah.
Okay. Soren, what are your thoughts on like the platform team versus the individual developer teams?
Yeah. I kind of disagree with everything Malcolm just said.
Excellent.
Surprise, surprise, surprise. So there's a few things. The famous quote, Terraform is just a bearer of bad news. The cloud is complex by itself. Yeah. So the bigger sort of question is, of course, should engineers need to learn how to deploy and manage infrastructure? And I guess the answer is no. And a lot of them also don't want to. So I would already start by saying like, hey, having engineers to learn Terraform is probably too much to ask. That's why a lot of companies then look at Pulumi and later on realize that, oh, now I shift the same problem to general purpose programming language, and it doesn't have much more either. So two things. On an accessibility point of view, I actually think that we should totally have more abstraction layers on top of Terraform, such as scaffolding. By the end of the day, I mean, we're building something in that direction that will now come in Q1, where you can just, upload a Terraform module, it builds an UI on top of it, some policies here that basically prevent users or you can restrict users from what input values to use. And there's a bunch of companies doing that. Resourcely is, for example, one of those that have been solving this problem in quite a good and excellent way. And I think it's
excellent.
Yeah, Resource is really good, and I think it's exactly the right thing to do. But it also only really solves the day zero operations, right? The maintenance and spotting issues in your underlying infrastructure, etc., is something where I think the DevOps and platform team will always play a supporting role. And again, by the end of the day, I think the success of your platform and DevOps team is to be measured on the ratio compared to your overall engineering organization. That's where you can really tell if an organization scales the DevOps team linearly to the engineering team, things are not going so well. On the workflow point of view, I would actually say if you ask engineers to, again, engineers are used to GitOps, right? And more so, like specifically to like, hey, I merge back to main. Now a build is being triggered and the deployment is being run to production. That's, I would say, how most of the organizations operate out there. Not all of them, but most of them. So having to move into a manual model where you then deploy the infrastructure from inside of a branch, from inside of a pull request, after a review and policy checks and whatnot, I think is very questionable versus orchestrating everything in the typical CD manner. So my take is also here that if you look at how folks deploy to Kubernetes, etc., right now the argument is that like, hey, we want to close the gap in between how the software development lifecycle and infrastructure development lifecycle is managed. And I would actually say using apply and merge is counterproductive. But again, by the end of the day, organizations have to figure out what works best for them. And there's a reason why they look at those workflows, and there's a reason why they're either prone to use one or another. And smart organizations will always do the assessment themselves and hopefully try both. So what I see actually, if you look at the market and if you look at the organizations that I've spoken to, around 65-70% is using apply after merge, and 30-35% is using apply before merge. And that sample size may also be biased based on my audience, of course. Yeah.
Right.
I do think this question of combining infrastructure with your code is conceptually interesting in the sense that to some degree, all of these workflows of managing infrastructure with pull requests is a bit of a square peg in a round hole, in that there's this really fundamental difference between your infrastructure code and your application code. And that is, you can build your application code all day long and you're just going to get an artifact out. And you can take that artifact and you can put it in one place and you put it in another place. It's going to do the same thing. You can copy that artifact. But infrastructure maps to a real physical world concept. And when you make a change to it, the old one is gone and now you have the new one. So for example, I think testing infrastructure is a really interesting question, because what are you actually testing when you run a test in Terraform? Well, you've brought this thing up in this this artificial cocoon of what you think things might be like, and things seem to happen. And then you bring it down and you say, all right, it's good. But then you put it in production and you're getting real traffic now, or maybe your networking is different in that situation. And that's just a totally different, you can never test for that because you will never have a dev environment that truly looks like production. And I think for us, this incongruence between infrastructure as code and application as code definitely runs into a challenge in talking to people and talking through what workflow is best for you, because it is hard to see these things as we want them to be the same thing, but they really are different at the end of the day.
Are we all just doing it wrong?
So my thing is it's an analogy, and all analogies are not really correct, but a lot of analogies are really sufficiently correct to be really useful. So matching your infrastructure as code as much as you can to how you think about software should be built is really a good way to just get by day to day very quickly and easily.
We have a question from Basil again, or Basil. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but he was asking about how does the apply before merge work when you've got many people creating PRs simultaneously, 3, 5, 10 people, all with open pull requests. How do you deal with the fact that those open pull requests may conflict with each other within the same repository and state?
So in the Terrateam world, if you have 10 people making changes to 10 different state directories or root modules, however you want to refer to them, then they will never conflict at all. And you can apply and merge and everything will just work as you expect. You won't invalidate anyone else's plan when that happens. Now, if you have people conflicting with each other on which state they're updating, and maybe they don't have a code, like a merge conflict, but they're just updating the same state directory, then once the first person applies, the next person's plans will all be invalidated and they'll have to replan them. So that is really, that can be a challenge if you have people going at the same directory. The last person is going to have to replan or just wait for replan 10 times or wait for everyone else to be done before they even really start their work. I think Soren mentioned like the Terralith and how that is, no matter which workflow you're choosing, the Terralith is gonna slow you down way more than any like perceived some optimized workflow, because you're just not going to be able to get out of this conflict.
Right. Okay.
But the conflict is way more apparent if you apply from inside of a pull request. I mean, we can agree here, no? Because you can still, I mean, you don't if you use if you merge after and if you apply after a merge, you actually essentially don't lock down the different environments, even if you plan a parallel.
But you do have to, right? Because so let's say you and I are modifying the same state directory. I merge, your plan is now possibly invalidated. So you have to replan. And what happens if you just click merge anyways, because nothing's stopping you from merging because you got all your approvals, but your plan's now invalid. If you have an apply before merge workflow, Terrateam's going to say, hey, I know you think everything's good, but actually we need to revoke this ability to apply right here. And now before you move on, you're going to have to plan again.
Right. So I don't wanna place my Terramate solution here once again, but I actually think those the argument for checks is actually invalid, because in GitHub, for example, at least in GitHub and in GitLab, you can enforce a branch to be up to date before it needs to be merged, before it can be merged. You can also do this automatically. So having an additional check, I don't think is yet again an answer to a problem that you kind of create here.
Well, I think so. Where that breaks down, I think, is if you do have a mono repo, we're modifying different state directories, and now you've merged, and I have to go update mine and replan because you've made a change that doesn't impact me. Whereas if we have this fine-grained ability to see these two people are conflicting with each other, we don't have to do that. So I think that's in the mono repo world, I think that's a huge win.
Fair enough, but I think if you move back to the original question, right, and now the Basil or whoever asked the question is asking like, hey, I have 10 people working in the same repository, right? Again, assuming that most of the environments out there are rather monolithic, and not working with that many fine-grained state files, I would say so. What is the answer to this question? Is the answer to this question that, like, hey, if there is multiple pull requests opened up in the same state file, you would run into less sort of conflicts compared to doing compared to applying on merge back to main?
I think you run into the exact same number of conflicts. There is no win there in either way, because you have to replan and apply. As long as you're enforcing that, whether you apply on merge or before merge, you're going to have to do the same number of plans and applies.
Interesting. That is not my perception.
So how would you get around? So let's assume that all 10 are modifying the same state directory. How are you going to get around? Person 1 goes first and applies. Person 2 might need to replan now, right?
Yeah, you rebase. You click a button and rebase.
Right. So it's the same number whether you're using Terrateam's apply before merge or you apply after merge. You still need the same. You have the same enforcement. Now you're saying you're doing it on GitHub requiring this thing, but Terrateam is requiring it in this other scenario as well. So it's the same workflow at the end of the day for that.
Right. With the difference that you don't need to have any conflict handling inside the pull request, right? So no locks.
You are having conflict handling. Like GitHub is forcing you to rebase all the time.
Yes. When a pull request is getting merged, you would have to press a button, update branch, which then triggers another commit and runs the plan again. I agree. But if you use PR locking, you would have to handle all those logs that are basically conflicting with each other. So in my opinion,
not in the Terrateam model, at least.
Okay.
So you only get the lock in Terrateam when you apply, and only one person can be
Got it. Okay, so you guys don't do a lock on a plan.
No. We do it on the tuple of the state directory and the workspace you're working.
Got it.
Yeah,
interesting.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
So it's very fine grained. We actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make it the most fine grained, exactly for issues that Soren is bringing up.
Interesting. Yeah. So if you're advocating generally for like a big mono repo that has individual environments and directories, then you're going to run into this conflict a lot as people are updating different environments. So you need a way to handle it. And whether that's through the locks that you're talking about, whereas if we're not working on the same directory, the lock isn't applied. But if we are, it is.
Correct.
Soren, what you're talking about is if I make a change, we're tracking everything within the trunk of the branch. So if somebody else has a pull request that's pending, even if it's targeting a totally different environment, they'll still need to run a fresh plan once I merge my stuff into main if I'm enforcing that restriction on the GitHub side.
Yeah, that is correct. And there's a specific edge case on how to work around it. Very specific though. So depending on the size of your state file, right? You may or may not want to enforce an update to the branch. Why? Because the change that you merge back from one branch into the main branch does not affect the plan, right? Inside of any other branch, there's no reason to update, right? Hence, you can just merge back to main and run and apply without having to replan at all, right? So there's a feature in Terramate Cloud that allows you to do that. But then, to be absolutely honest, the amount of companies or the number of companies that are using that much of a granularity of state files, as are mostly companies or mostly organizations that have adopted Terramate and then moved to this, versus like I don't see that many having this out of the box, which is also due to the reason of how HashiCorp advocates workspaces, etc. So what I'm trying to say here is that obviously only works if your state files are small enough to cause as few conflicts as possible. And then it's more a philosophical question, I guess, whether you want to manage that many state files, which makes other things more tedious, like output sharing, etc. And that we just talked about it. So that highly depends. Whereas I'm personally prone to do that for blast radius limitations and runtimes and this kind of things, but I guess it's kind of out of scope of this discussion here. Yeah.
It has been quite a discussion. We are almost at the top of the hour, and before we go over, I want to pause here and first start off by thanking both of you for making the time and your busy schedules to have this conversation with me. I hope everybody who's watching found it informative and educational. Before I let you two go, Malcolm, why don't you tell people where they can find you online and find more about Terrateam?
Yep, just go to terrateam.io. We recently open sourced, so hit the GitHub button there and check it out. And there's directions just to get going in a few minutes with Docker Compose.
Okay, awesome. I'll include links in the show notes or whatever later when I finish updating this. Soren, same question.
Just go to terramate.io. Start our repository. CLI is open source. There's a bunch of great getting started guides in the documentation, and an awesome video with Ned, and then also a Discord community in case you have any questions.
Hey, excellent. Once again, thank you both of you for taking the time today, and thanks for everybody watching and for your questions and comments. They really helped enliven the discussion, so it's very much appreciated. You can always find me at nedinthecloud.com, and until next time, keep calm, Terraform on. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ned. Thanks, Soren.
And you.